This video is one in a series that provides detailed information on the Motorola StarMax family of computer systems. We recommend that you have pen and paper handy to take notes. Always remember to follow proper ESD procedures whenever you are assembling or disassembling hardware. Motorola's StarMax 3000 and 4000 series mini tower models are based on and support the Apple Macintosh operating system. They provide multimedia capabilities with a range of expansion possibilities. StarMax is based on a number of proven and popular technologies, including a PowerPC 603E or 604E microprocessor, a PCI bus, EIDE capabilities, and a mesh or Macintosh Enhanced SCSI hardware interface. Standard features include 5 expansion slots for PCI cards, a soft eject floppy diskette drive, a 2.5 gigabyte EIDE disk drive, an 8-speed Atapi CD-ROM drive, L2 cache with a maximum of 512 kilobytes, 3 DIMM slots with RAM expandable to 160 megabytes, 6 drive bays, integrated audio and video, and Grand Illusion PCI support. There are 5 bays on the front of the unit. The top 3 are for 5 1/4 inch devices, while the 4th and 5th bays hold 3 1/2 inch devices. The first bay typically contains the CD-ROM drive, and the 4th bay holds the soft eject floppy drive. Below the floppy drive are the power LED and power switch. Below the power switch is the reset switch. On the back of the unit are the ports and expansion slots. At the top is a power supply voltage switch with the AC inlet just below it. The voltage switch can be set to either 115 or 230 volts AC. Be certain this switch is set correctly before plugging in the unit. In the middle of the back panel are several ports. The top 2 ports are for a PS2 mouse and a PS2 keyboard. Below these ports is the Apple Desktop Bus, or ADB port, which is used for an Apple keyboard and mouse. And below the ADB port are the Apple Printer port and the Apple Modem port. Next are the 2 mini-plug audio jacks. The mic-in connector is used to record audio from a microphone. The line-out connector is used to send audio to external recording equipment, headphones, or self-powered speakers. Finally, below the audio connectors is the SVGA connector. If an Apple monitor is being used, an adapter must be plugged into this port. On the right side of the unit is a SCSI interface. This 25-pin connector supports external mesh or Macintosh Enhanced SCSI hardware devices. Up to 5 external SCSI devices, such as disk drives or CD-ROM drives, may be connected using this port. Below the SCSI interface are 5 PCI expansion slots. When setting up the unit, select a stable area where the unit will not experience excessive movement or jarring. The area must also be free of excessive heat, dust, smoke, and electrostatic discharge. Arrange a setup that is comfortable for users and that allows easy access for service, both front and rear. And allow at least 6 inches clearance on all sides for proper airflow for cooling. Please make customers aware of this requirement. Attach power cords, monitor cables, and other peripheral cables to their appropriate connectors on all components. Plug all power cords into wall outlets or power strips, preferably with surge protection. Check all cable connections for proper seating. Refer to the StarMax User's Guide for booting instructions. Keep the following in mind when removing field-replaceable units from the chassis. Keep internal cables away from the motherboard to prevent damage to it. Be aware of all keyed connectors in the unit, including the connectors on the EIDE and SCSI cables. Also, when removing connectors from a device or the motherboard, be certain to grasp the connector, not the cable. Pulling on the cable may separate it from the connector. To disassemble the unit, you will need a number 1 Phillips screwdriver and a 3/16" hex nut driver. Before disassembly, power down the system. Disconnect all external cables and place the unit on a stable desk-high surface with sufficient workspace. Be prepared to follow all appropriate ESD procedures. To remove the cover, face the back of the unit and remove the 4 screws from the back of the enclosure. Slide the cover back about 1 inch. Then lift the cover up and off the chassis. Now face the front of the unit. The top 3 external bays on the front of the unit all support 1.5-inch high devices. A CD-ROM drive is usually configured for the top bay. This drive is removable from the front of the unit. From the back of the drive, disconnect the data cable and the power cable. Also notice the audio cable that leads from the back of the drive to the motherboard. This cable may be difficult to disconnect from the drive without first removing the drive from the bay. First, disconnect the end of the cable that is attached to the motherboard by depressing the lock tab and gently pulling on the connector, noting the location of the connector on the motherboard. This connector is fragile, so use care. Now, remove the 4 screws securing the CD-ROM to the drive bay. Then slide the assembly toward you. As you remove the drive assembly, carefully guide the audio cable through the bay opening. Once the drive is removed, disconnect the audio cable by depressing its lock tab on the back of the CD-ROM drive and gently pulling the connector. In order to remove the EIDE and floppy drives, the motherboard drawer must be pulled out of the chassis. Place the unit on its side. The motherboard is mounted in a slide-out drawer assembly. Before sliding out the drawer, you must remove several cables attached to the motherboard. These include a soft power connector, 2 power connectors labeled P10 and P11, 2 power connectors labeled P1 and P2, and data cables for the floppy, hard disk, and CD-ROM drives. When you are removing these cables, note their locations and the labeling on both the cables and the motherboard. To remove the 3-pin soft power connector, squeeze the tab slightly and gently pull the connector away from the motherboard. Next, remove the power supply connectors by pulling straight up on the connectors and then tilting slightly. And finally, remove the data cables by pulling up on each connector while pressing down slightly on adjacent connectors in order to support the motherboard. You must remove several cables attached to the front of the motherboard. These include connectors for the speaker, power switch, reset switch, power LED, and fan power. The connectors on the motherboard are labeled, as well as those on the cables. Also, pin 1 is referenced on the motherboard and on each cable connector. Carefully pull straight up on each connector, noting its location and orientation on the motherboard. Now slide the motherboard drawer away from the rear of the chassis. With the cables removed and the motherboard drawer out of the chassis, you can easily remove the EIDE and floppy drives and the power supply. First, set the unit upright. The EIDE hard drive is normally installed in the bottom drive bay. This placement provides the best clearance for access and cooling. First, from the back of the drive, disconnect the data and power cables. Remove the 4 mounting screws, securing the drive to the drive bay. Holding the assembly from the bottom, guide the drive toward the inside of the chassis until it releases from its compartment. Then remove it. Note: a hard drive can be installed in the rear drive bay, which is under the power supply at the rear of the unit. This drive would be held in place with screws. The floppy drive assembly is located in the 4th drive bay. Because it is a soft eject floppy, there is only one cable leading to the back of the floppy disk drive. Disconnect this combination data power cable from the drive. Remove the 4 screws that secure the drive to the front of the chassis. Carefully slide the floppy disk drive out the front of the chassis. The combination power supply and fan unit is toward the rear of the chassis. Removal of this unit will be easier if you face the back of the chassis. Remove the 4 screws from the back of the chassis. Push the power supply forward slightly, then lift it up and out of the chassis. With its tray removed from the unit, the motherboard is easily accessed. The PCI riser card, which is seated perpendicular to the motherboard, provides connection between the motherboard and any PCI expansion cards in the unit. To remove the riser card, you must first remove all PCI cards attached to it. Remove any screws holding the cards to the chassis and disconnect any cables attached to the cards. Pull out each card while supporting the riser card with the other hand. Once all the PCI cards are removed, the riser card can be removed. First, remove the 2 screws holding the riser card to the bracket on the rear of the card. Pull up on the riser card firmly, but gently, until the card is clear of its slot. A small rocking motion may help release the card. Disconnect the SCSI cable connector from the motherboard, pulling straight up on the connector. The other end of the SCSI cable is attached to the back panel. Remove the hex nuts on the back of the unit that secure the connector. Then remove the cable. The motherboard contains the microprocessor, main memory DIMM slots, interfaces for SCSI and I/O, and the keyboard and mouse ports, an L2 cache DIMM slot, a video DIMM slot, the battery, the GIMO slot, and riser card connection. If you need to remove the video DIMM or the L2 cache card, simply pull it up and off the motherboard. There are 3 DIMM slots for memory. The first slot can contain only single-sided DIMMs, while slots 2 and 3 can accept double-sided DIMMs. To remove a DIMM, press the latches outward at each end of the slot. Then grasp the module and pull up. Note that the DIMMs are keyed and can only be inserted one way. To install DIMMs on the motherboard, note the location of the key on the DIMM. Press down on one side of the DIMM, then on the other, until the latches snap into place. To remove the battery, detach the cable from the motherboard, noting its location and orientation. Then tilt the battery to one side to detach the Velcro strip. To replace the battery, simply press the new battery into place on the Velcro pad and connect the cable to the appropriate motherboard location. Now remove the 7 screws that hold the motherboard to the chassis. Set the screws aside, but be sure to notice their type. To minimize stress on the motherboard, you should use only this type of screw to hold it in place. Facing the rear of the chassis, grasp the motherboard at the farthest end and lift. Tilt the board as you slide it away from you until the connectors clear the rear chassis panel. Then lift the board out of the chassis. Note that later revisions of the motherboard will have 2 standoffs and 5 screws. The bezel has 2 panels. To install an externally accessible device, you must remove the main bezel. To replace the LED, reset switch, or power switch, only the bezel insert needs to be removed. To remove the bezel insert, face the front of the unit. Slide the insert to the right until the tabs are clear of the slots in the bezel. Then pull the bezel insert away from the unit. The switches and power on LED are contained in the plastic assembly secured to the bezel insert by clips. Spread the clips to remove the assembly and access the LED and switches. To remove the LED, pull it from the light pipe assembly. Reinsert the LED by pushing it into the assembly. To remove a switch, lift it from the assembly. Reinsert a replacement by placing it back into the assembly. Reattach the power on LED and switch assembly by pressing it into the clips on the insert. To replace the bezel insert, position the tabs on the insert in the slots on the main bezel. Then slide the insert to the left until it locks into position. To remove the main bezel, remove the 2 screws, one on either side, midway on the chassis. Facing the front of the chassis, locate the 2 latches at the top of the bezel and press upward on the latches. With the latches free, pull the bezel away from the chassis slightly until the top 2 latches are clear of the slots. Detach the switch and LED assembly from the insert. Continue to pivot the bezel away from the chassis and lift slightly to clear the lower latches and remove the bezel. An auxiliary fan and a speaker are mounted in an enclosure inside the front of the chassis. To remove the fan and speaker enclosure, squeeze on the top and bottom to release the clips and remove it. The fan is held in the enclosure by 2 tabs. To remove the fan from its enclosure, use your thumbs to spread the tabs away from the fan and push it out of the assembly. Note the direction of the arrow on the fan. This arrow indicates the direction of the airflow. When replacing the fan, the air must flow into the chassis. To replace the fan, simply press it into the enclosure with the flow arrow pointed into the enclosure until the tabs lock the fan in place. Direct the fan wires through the slots in the enclosure. To remove the speaker, pull it free of the enclosure. The speaker is very fragile and can be damaged easily, so use extra care during removal. To replace it, simply press the speaker back into the enclosure. Note that later revisions of this unit may have screws securing the speaker directly to the inside front of the chassis. To demonstrate the installation of field replaceable units, we will begin with the motherboard. To insert the motherboard into its drawer, face the rear of the drawer. Tilt the motherboard slightly as you lower it onto the drawer. Slide the board toward you, lining up the ports with their openings in the rear of the drawer. Press it against the EMI shield on the back of the drawer, aligning the screw holes in the board with the openings in the drawer. Replace the 7 screws. Attach the SCSI cable to the motherboard and push down on the connector until it is fully seated. Reattach the external SCSI connection to the back of the drawer. Insert the riser card into its slot on the motherboard with the mounting holes near the back of the drawer. Note that the riser card needs to be on the unthreaded side of the riser card bracket. Once the riser card is fully inserted in its slot, secure it to the riser card bracket using the 2 screws previously removed. Replace any PCI cards that you removed from the riser card and reconnect any necessary cables. Replace any screws that originally secured the cards to their slots in the chassis. To reattach the bezel, replace the switch and LED assembly on the bezel insert. Then face the front of the chassis and grasp the bezel. Insert the latches on the bottom of the bezel into the corresponding openings on the chassis. Snap the bezel onto the front of the unit. Using the 2 screws removed from the bezel, secure it to the chassis. Use caution when tightening these screws to ensure that they do not strip. Install the fan and speaker enclosure by aligning its tabs with the slots on the chassis. Gently press the enclosure until it locks in place. Now reinstall the drives. First attach the CD audio cable to the rear of the CD-ROM drive. Face the front of the unit. While guiding the CD audio cable ahead of the CD-ROM drive, install the drive through the front of the bezel until it aligns with the bezel. Then secure the drive using 4 screws, 2 on either side of the drive. Next, guide the floppy disk drive into its bay from the front of the bezel and secure it using 4 screws. You may have to provide support to the back of the drive as you are doing this. Guide the hard disk drive through from the rear of the drive cage until the drive screw holes align with the drive cage holes. If only one hard drive is installed here, place it in the lowest bay to provide better cooling. Secure the drive using 4 screws. Facing the back of the unit, lower the power supply into the chassis and slide it toward the rear. Replace the 4 screws that secure the unit to the rear chassis panel. Because the motherboard is still easily accessible, we'll connect the data cables to it now. First, connect the floppy drive cable, then the IDE hard disk data cable, and finally, the CD-ROM drive data cable. To replace the motherboard drawer, first place the chassis on its side. Then slide the drawer into the chassis, ensuring that the drawer is positioned in the guides on each side, and lock it into place. Reconnect the cables on the front of the motherboard, noting the pin 1 locations on both the connectors and the motherboard. First, the speaker, then the power switch, the reset switch, the power on LED, and finally, the fan power wires. Reconnect the CD audio cable, ensuring that the latch is fully engaged. Insert the power connectors at P10 and P11 on the motherboard. Plug in the power connectors at P1 and P2. Then connect the soft power connector. Stand the unit upright. Reconnect the data cables for the hard disk drive, floppy disk drive, and the CD-ROM drive. Then connect the power cables to the CD-ROM drive and the hard disk drive. Note that the floppy drive receives both power and data from its single cable, so no separate power cable is required. To replace the cover, face the rear of the unit. Notice the inserts located at the top front of the cover. With the cover at a slight angle, align the inserts on the front of the cover with the lip on the front of the chassis. Pivot the cover down, ensuring that the inserts in the cover fit over the edge of the chassis. Confirm that the edges of the cover fit under the edges of the bezel and that all the inserts engage the chassis. Secure the cover using 4 screws at the back. This concludes the hardware assembly overview of the StarMax 3000 and 4000 mini tower models.